Hi, my name is Joe, and this is my laboratory. So I say, Great Scott, welcome to Joe's Laboratory. A couple of months ago, I made a video out in the garage about my reconditioned 60 over 350 Chevy small block. At the time, I thought it was ready to go back on the engine stand for further assembly, but when I actually did put it back on the stand and began mocking it up without piston rings to check the bearing clearances, I found out I was sadly mistaken. For starters, I found a couple aberrations in the deck surfaces of the block. One was right next to a water port, right where one of the elastomer beads of the Titan ICS head gaskets I planned to use would have gone right over the top of it. And the other was on the rear lifter valley rail, the other side. Next, the first piston I put in, I noticed at least 30 thousandths of deck height above the piston at top dead center. Although I found all that bewildering, it was after I read up on the recommended piston to wall clearance for my Probe SRS pistons that I began to get downright depressed. According to Probe, SRS pistons like mine should have a piston to wall clearance of only 3 to 7 thousandths of an inch. There is also a note that states that any application which uses forced induction or nitrous oxide should have more than the minimum required clearance. How much more? Who knows? It depends on how much the piston expands with the additional heat that the forced induction or nitrous oxide creates. This led me to read up on the alloy that Probe pistons are made of. These Probe pistons are forged with 2618 alloy rather than the typical 4032 alloy, which has been so popular with forged piston manufacturers for decades. 2618 is a tougher alloy than 4032, but it contains far less silicone, which makes it way more susceptible to heat expansion. Since my pistons are slightly worn from running them about 12,000 miles in my last block, they have a piston to cylinder wall clearance of 4 thousandths of an inch, but that's still only 1 thousandths over the minimum required clearance. Since I did observe some scuffing in my last block, I agonized over this tolerance because too little clearance causes scuffing and too much causes piston slap. I didn't know what to do until I discovered a product to enhance the oiling system from Bolaws Performance of Orlando, Florida. Bolaws makes a kit with drill guide blocks, a long drill bit, and a couple of taps for installing little brass wrist pin oiler tubes in the main bearing webs of an engine block to assist in cooling the pistons and to help lubricate the wrist pins. As soon as I found out about this kit, I knew it was the solution for me, but I still had other issues. When I bolted the cam socket onto my camshaft, lubed the camshaft journals, and fully installed it, I found it was way too difficult to turn. I didn't know what the problem was at the time, but for me, that was just the last straw. For all the aforementioned reasons, I decided to remove the crank from the block a second time, have the block decked again, and get the wrist pin oiler kit from Bolaws Performance installed as well. I took the block back to Central Florida Machine and Speed and got it decked another 20 thousandths. While I was there, I had the camshaft problem looked at and found out that my camshaft was bent. I'd never heard of anybody having a bent camshaft, but rolling it on a jig under a dial indicator, you could certainly see where it was bent. Fortunately for me, he was able to straighten it without breaking it, and I didn't have to buy a new camshaft. After that, I took my block and wrist pin oiler kit over to an aircraft AP I know who does machine work on the side. He has a milling machine and a lathe out in his garage, and since I've known him for years, I knew I could trust him to properly install my wrist pin oiler kit. However, after he accepted the job to install the wrist pin oiler kit, the list of things to do grew longer. I decided it would be a good time to install oil return screens and vent tubes in the lifter valley and he pointed out that the skirts of the cylinders needed to be blended with a hand grinder to eliminate the potential for cracks there. Later on, I realized I had no head guide pins, that I needed to plug 8 water ports on the block there was no match for on the heads, and then he discovered that the steel water jacket plugs were frozen, had to be drilled out, and that there was a casting flash on the outside of the block that needed to be grinded off too. 2 months later, and here it is. I'll zoom in now for a closer look. On the top of the block here can be seen the lifter valley vent tubes threaded into the holes that were tapped for them, and the locations of the Marasso oil return screens that were epoxied in the back and press fit into the front. The tops of the block have obviously been surfaced again. New guide pins are in all the way around. Plus, stainless steel plugs sealed with Loctite have been tapped in flush in 4 locations on both sides of the block. Looking through the empty cylinders, the gold tips of the brass wrist pin nozzles can be seen where they break the surfaces of the main bearing webs that overlap one edge of each bore, here, here, and here. Rolling the block over reveals the brass water jacket plugs that replaced the steel ones that had to be drilled out. But zooming in closer shows even more. Now we can see the wrist pin nozzle holes that were drilled with the guide blocks bolted in the main bearing saddles, and the channels cut from them to the main bearing oil feed ports afterwards with a die grinder. We can see where the skirts of the pistons have been smoothed out, and we can see the bottom of a piston I tie wrapped in place just to show where the wrist pin nozzles are going to splash them all with oil. We have to zoom in even closer to see that though. With the additional light, if I can get it aimed properly, the strand of wire I painted red and pushed through the nozzle could be seen making contact with the underside of the crown, right under the manufacturer's logo. It's pretty obvious from the discoloration of the small ends of all the connecting rods that this area of the piston can certainly use the added lubrication that the wrist pin oilers will provide. The next step for me is to clean the iron dust left from the drilling and grinding, install the crank for the 3rd time, put the pistons in without rings again, and recheck the rod bearing clearances with the new 21 thousandths oversized bearings I have here. The first time I checked the rod bearing clearances, it was with a new set of 20 thousandths over bearings, but then Plastigauge showed me I had some rods with as much as 3 thousandths of an inch clearance, and I think that's excessive, especially for a forced induction street machine. Once I have all the bearing clearances where they need to be, I can pull the pistons once more, put the total seal rings I've already file fitted on them, and then put them in to stay. Well, that's all for this episode of Joe's Laboratory. Hopefully it won't take me 2 more months before I'm ready to present the next one. Until then, happy hot rodding.